Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to be back at that hotbed of liberalism, the Calgary. Petroleum. Longtime fans of the national energy policy. Nice centralized social programs of the Trudeau kind. You know, that always gets a warm welcome here. This is, have I been here 4 times, 5 times? I've been here many times, and it's a room that I think of with great affection, and I'm delighted to be part of this debate with Danielle, and I'm looking forward to getting at it. My proposition is equalization is good for Canada, but this is really the theme is really broader. This is really a debate about what kind of Canada you want. It's really a debate about where you see Alberta in the Federation. I've accepted to come here because the future of the Canadian economy, the future of the Canadian Federation is going to be determined in Alberta. And the question is, what kind of leadership Alberta is going to provide for the rest of the country? That's really the question. And the question is whether you want an Alberta that's leading from the front, that believes passionately that we need rough equality of opportunity in our country, that we don't want provinces to be left behind, that is not only good for Canada, that vision of basic equality is not only good for Canada, but it's crucial to the economic future of Alberta. So that's really what the debate is about. Now, equalization is a program of the federal government, and it's not any program of the federal government. It is a constitutional obligation of the federal government. It's in the Constitution Act. Committed to the principle of making equalization payments to ensure that provincial governments have sufficient revenues to provide reasonably comparable levels of public service at reasonably comparable levels of taxation. It works like this. A calculation is made of the fiscal capacity of each province, and some provinces that fall beneath that standard of fiscal capacity get an equalization payment. That equalization payment comes from your taxation, from federal taxation. It is not a standard that seeks to take away from the fiscal capacity of a province. In other words, equalization does not lower the fiscal capacity of the province of Alberta. The federal government doesn't take provincial revenues from the province of Alberta and put it in a pot in Ottawa and take it away from you and deprive you of your opportunity to run goods and services and programs the way you want. You pay federal tax, and the federal government sends $14 billion to about 5 provinces who do not have the fiscal capacity or are below the fiscal capacity of other states, other provinces. That's basically how the system works. And here's how it works. I think it's important to notice, don't worry, this is not going to be a professorial lecture, but facts help, eh? You know, don't you think? That equalization, which is the red item here, is in every case a small part of the federal transfers to the provinces. The Canada Health Transfer, the Canada Social Transfer, these items also go to Alberta, and they are per capita transfers. And so equalization is not the only thing that the federal government does to make sure that when you wake up in Canada, you can count on roughly comparable access to education, health care, public infrastructure. And the idea of equalization is pretty simple. It's that your chances in life, your opportunities in life in Canada shouldn't depend on your postcode. That's what this is really about. To provide rough comparability in the public services that all governments across Canada provide. It doesn't mandate what services you provide. This is not a program in which Ottawa then dictates a certain kind of progressive, left-wing, liberal-style social program. No. These are block transfers where provinces have the right to spend the money as they wish, including using it to reduce their taxation. Now, it's very true, observant members of this audience will look and see this thing, which is that the federal government raises more revenue in Alberta than it spends in Alberta. But that's good news. It means you're a rich province with high per capita income. You're doing great. But the way the federal system works is that in other provinces that need a bit of help, like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Manitoba, Prince Edward Island, and increasingly Ontario, the federal government steps in with this $14 billion that essentially tries to equalize the provision of government services across Canada. Now, let's get to the contribution that Alberta makes. These are payments that you pay in your federal income tax, and they're paid in federal corporate taxes. Flows into the federal treasury, and the government of Canada takes $14.2 billion of all that money and uses it to equalize the fiscal capacity of provinces. Alberta accounts for 16.7% of federal revenue raised right across Canada. And if you do 16.7% of 14.2 billion, you get that number. So when you get down to the hard kernel of fact here, equalization costs Alberta $2.4 billion a year. Okay? That's what we're talking about. And the issue is that good for Alberta? Is that bad for Alberta? The issue is, does an equalization program of $14.2 billion break the store, ruin our fiscal responsibility, or does it actually do something which seems to be pretty simple? Give Canadian citizens roughly comparable levels of public services from coast to coast to coast. Now, these charts are telling you Alberta is currently putting more into the Federation than it gets out, and it's spending $2.4 billion every year to help other provinces. What does Alberta get back? Many Canadians want to come to Alberta to work. One of the functions of equalization is to train that labor force, to educate that labor force, to give you the labor you need. To the degree that you get Newfoundlanders, you get Nova Scotians, you get New Brunswickers coming out here, it's actually a good thing. You train them up and they come here and they're ready to go, and they're ready to work in a booming economy, an economy that all Canadians are proud of. But it also has another effect. It stabilizes labor force growth. What do I mean by that? I mean that you don't want the whole darn country here. You want lots of Canadians coming to work here, but you don't want New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Prince Edward Island totally depopulated, and everybody running up to Fort McMurray. Well, one of the ways that Canada enables that to happen is we provide rough comparability of public and social services right across the country. And it's a good investment because it stabilizes labor force flows into your province. And finally, to the degree that equalization payments and government activity in the economy in have-not provinces stimulates demands for Alberta goods and services, it's good for you as well. And I get this. If you go to Northern Ontario, you go to parts across the country and you ask anybody in a steel mill, who are you making pipe for? They all know who they're making pipe for. They're making pipe for you. Canadians understand how important it is for the Alberta economy to be successful. Equally important for Alberta to understand how important it is to sustain rough comparability of public investment and public infrastructure right across the country. Equalization is good for Canada for a basic moral principle. which is that it sustains rough equality of citizenship. And equality of citizenship simply means that your chances in life, your opportunities, don't depend on your postcode. They don't depend on where you live. Anywhere you get up in Canada, you can count on a semi-decent school. You can count on a semi-decent hospital. You can count on a semi-decent public infrastructure, roads, that kind of stuff. We don't want a Canada where the opportunities, where the life chances are determined by where you live, and where life becomes a kind of fate. You're born there, you're stuck there, you can't move. If people want to move, great, but I don't think anybody thinks it's a good idea to have a country where the only place where economic growth is occurring is in Alberta, and the only way you can have a life is to hightail it out of a place you were born to another great province. You want to have a Canada where people think, I can make a life here. I can make a life here. And that's what equalization tries to achieve. It shares burdens for education, health, care, and training. It stabilizes labor force flows, and it maintains a rough equality between provinces in the Federation. Now what does the yellow one say? Oh, okay, it's not as bad as that. It's the red one I got in front. Okay. So it's good for Canada. Let me just say one other thing here to get into the debate phase of this, because I'm interested in listening to Danielle as opposed to just going from my talking points. But when I studied this to prepare, because I wanted to pay Wildrose the respect of preparing, I noticed that in your literature you say that it'd be better to transfer tax points to provinces. Well, the problem with that is that if you do that, provinces with weak fiscal capacity simply won't be able to use the tax points to provide roughly comparable services. In other words, transferring tax points doesn't solve the problem of making us more or less equal in the public services we can call on. Now, one of the most important facts about this debate is that equalization does not allow have-not provinces to keep their taxes low and use revenue from out of province. What actually happens, and this is interesting, is the tax rates, this is an important point, tax rates are higher in have-not provinces than have provinces. Tax rates are higher in provinces that get equalization than they are in provinces that do not receive equalization. Provincial-based tax rates in Alberta come in at about 12%. The provincial tax rate in Quebec is nearly 22, nearly double. So the argument, which you hear in Wild Rose, that have-not provinces are using equalization to get someone else to fund their expensive social programs is not correct. Quebec pays its own social programs. What equalization does, listen to me here, this is what we're doing. They pay double the tax rates of Alberta. What equalization does is prevent the tax rates going even higher, right? That's the argument. But the argument that Quebec and other provinces are running expensive social programs off your back just isn't so. Because the facts are, they're paying for it in tax rates that are often double your own. And finally, it's not realistic to cap Alberta's equalization contribution, because it's not as if the equalization is a pot of money kind of sequestered from Alberta and carried off to Ottawa in a train. That's not how it works. You pay federal income tax, and out of that federal income tax and out of corporation tax, equalization to the sum of $14.2 billion is paid. There's no way to slice up the particular Alberta contribution or to cap it. It's just not a realistic policy proposal. Finally, let me conclude here by referring to a Canadian who I was always proud to meet when I came to Calgary. We were of different political families, but I think there isn't a person in the room who doesn't think he was a great Albertan and a great Canadian. And I think he raises up raises us up above the detail of equalization and gets us to focus on what really matters, which is, what is your vision as Albertans of your relationship between being an Albertan and a Canadian? And here's a great Albertan saying, I'm a Canadian before an Albertan, and there isn't anybody who would claim that Peter Lougheed didn't passionately defend the fiscal autonomy, the jurisdictional autonomy of a great province. But he also understood that this is ultimately a question of loyalties and commitments to strangers beyond the provincial borders. It's a commitment to make sure that every Canadian gets up in the morning and thinks this country is more or less fair. It's not perfect, but it's more or less fair. My hospital is pretty good. My school is pretty good. My roads are pretty okay. I'm proud to be a Canadian because those goods are shared across the country by my fellow citizens. We're in this together. We share burdens together. We create opportunity together. That's why equalization is a constitutional commitment of all Canadian governments, going back a very long time, and why, in my judgment, it's not just a fiscal program. It's not just about money. It's about a fundamental vision of Canada, which I passionately support, and which I believe great leaders like Peter Lougheed did too. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I'm just delighted to be here. I was speaking with Mr. Ignatieff about some of the things he enjoyed about politics and some things he didn't enjoy so much about politics, and we've both had a little bit of a rough ride by the media from time to time, so we did talk a bit about that. And I have been a bit amused to read some of the media reports about what Mr. Ignatieff and I have both apparently said about the issue of equalization. He, for instance, was reported to have said that the country would fall apart without equalization. I think that was part of the reason for the original title of this debate. I was reported to have said that the Wild Rose wants to blow up equalization. Such is the nature of trying to communicate a very complex subject in what has become a soundbite world, which is why I'm very delighted this evening to have the opportunity to hear Mr. Ignatieff him speak with his more nuanced position about equalization, and also to have an opportunity to share my own. I do want to begin as well, though, by thanking the organizers for putting this together this evening so that we could talk about the very serious issue of equalization and how it impacts Canada as a confederation and why it's time for a new vision, a vision that's quite different from the one Mr. Ignatieff spoke about. I'm going to begin by giving an overview of what I see to be the unfair outcomes and misguided principles that are currently embodied in our equalization program. I'm glad he spoke about the Canada Health Transfer and the social transfer. I will touch about those a bit as well. I'll then touch on some of the flaws in the current formula and point out some of the possibilities for reform. The policy wonks in the room, I think, are going to enjoy this part, but I do promise the rest of you that I will stay brief. And I'll close with a few words countering this notion that equalization, and lots of it, is the only thing that is holding Canada together. I'll describe my vision for a united Canada, which is one where our bonds are built on our strengths as provinces, not on our weaknesses. Though I have no doubt that Mr. Ignatieff and I disagree on many things, on many things we disagree, in fact, I think we can begin this discussion by talking about the things where we do agree. Canada is a complex country. It is a country of 10 provinces in three territories within 5 regions. It has 3 founding cultures, Aboriginal, English, and French. It has a multitude of diverse cultural minorities and, of course, 2 linguistic groups. Even with such great diversity, we are all one nation. We are all Canadian, even if there are a minority of Quebecers who call themselves Quebecers first, and an even smaller minority of Quebecers who call themselves Quebecers only. I've been pleased to read, though, that Mr. Ignatieff supports, at least notionally, the concept that Mr. Harper speaks of a lot, which is this concept of focused federalism, that the federal government should be a competent manager in its areas of jurisdiction, and by that is, I mean, of course, defense, borders, common economic market, core infrastructure, and also that the federal government should respect the jurisdiction of the provinces. However, I believe that we have very different ideas about the role that Ottawa should play in supporting the provinces when it comes to this issue of dollars and cents, when it comes to the issue of fiscal transfers. I spoke to Réseau Liberté Quebec about a year and a half ago in April, and I started this conversation. I told them that Alberta and Quebec, if we are ever going to achieve what we are capable of, we have to stop viewing Ottawa as the vehicle to get us there. Now keep in mind, and we know this, but I will reiterate based on the slides that were shown, the biggest cost of government in Alberta is the huge difference between what Ottawa takes in taxes and premiums and then what it sends back to us in federal spending. We regard this as the net cost to us of Confederation. And the current fiscal imbalance, Mr. Ignatieff spoke of 2009-10, as of 2011, our current fiscal imbalance is $19 billion a year. Now by comparison, Alberta's entire healthcare system costs us $15 billion. And for that, we at least get healthcare. For $19 billion in our annual overpayment to the federal government, we get nothing, not even gratitude. And I must say to our friends in Ontario, the situation is much the same there. In fact, it's worse because Ontario's manufacturing economy has been battered by foreign competition. Ontario is in rough shape. It is now even receiving a relatively small equalization payment, yet it is still subsidizing federal programs in the receiving provinces at about the same level that Alberta is because of the other transfers that Mr. Ignatieff had mentioned. And it is subsidizing those programs in have-not provinces, programs they can no longer afford to pay for themselves. The same is happening to a lesser degree in British Columbia and in Saskatchewan. Now, the conversation that we need to start is for the net payer provinces to propose to the recipient provinces, first and foremost Quebec, and I'll speak more of Quebec, constructive ways of shifting the basis of assistance away from dependency, which is what we have right now, and toward productivity gains, so that we can see productivity gains and economic growth in all regions. So does this mean blowing up equalization? The legislation that sets out the raison d'etre for equalization uses the word, and we saw it earlier, reasonably, twice. Subsection 36 of the Constitution Act of 1982 says that equalization was meant to ensure that provincial governments have sufficient revenues to provide reasonably comparable levels of public services at reasonably comparable levels of taxation. So it should also be reasonably prudent to conduct a regular review to see if the reasonableness of the original concept is still in play. And an unemotional examination of the entire process will reveal some shortcomings that should be addressed if Canadians of all political leanings, of all regions, of all income and taxation classes can continue to support equalization into the future. Now I say unemotional because some Canadians, perhaps including some in this room, perhaps even some on this stage, are so deeply committed to the vaunted Canadian characteristic notion of fairness, which is supposed to be the underlying principle of equalization, that they are blind to the imbalances, the blatant unfairness of it all, blind to the perverse outcomes that this program is perpetuating. Equalization, as we know it, is not working. It's not working for the contributor provinces like Alberta. It is not working for the recipient provinces like Quebec. We cannot continue to support a program that encourages economies to underperform, while at the same time over-equalizes on payments. So today, have-not provinces, as we know, offer more generous social programs than we have right here in Alberta. Equalization, though created with admirable intentions, is no longer working for us here in Alberta. It is having detrimental effects, in fact, across Canada, punishing those with strong economies and discouraging recipient provinces from attempting to grow and diversify their economies. From Alberta's perspective, we've got our own pressures from the tens of thousands of people who bring their families here each year to begin a new life. Now, I'm fully aware that this is an enviable position to be in. It's an enviable problem to have. But when they come from other parts of the country, though they may bring their education with them, they do not bring their infrastructure with them. We have big strains on our healthcare system, our education, our transportation system. All of our municipalities are swamped with the needs for new neighborhoods that the influx of new people bring. So we look around the country and we ask, are these massive equalization transfers really helping the so-called have-not provinces provide services that are reasonably equivalent to what we have in Alberta? Because if that $19 billion really were needed for adequate core services for our fellow Canadians, I am pretty confident that Albertans would be willing to part with it, even though we face our own budget challenges here. But it becomes somewhat galling to Albertans, myself included, when we see much of that contribution going not to governments in other provinces that are struggling to provide equivalent services, critical programs, roughly comparable to what we provide here, but to governments which offer extravagant programs that that here in Alberta, we either think that our government can't afford to pay for, or that it shouldn't pay for. And there are several examples that are front of mind when it comes to the topic of equalization, including Quebec's subsidized daycare program, and Quebec's subsidized tuition rates, and subsidies for hydroelectricity, and the different drug plans, and the different insurance coverage they have. Not to mention that they have more nurses, and teachers, and civil servants per capita than we have here in the Have provinces. And many of these social programs I've just mentioned in these supposedly have-not provinces, such as Quebec, go not only towards those who are struggling, but often subsidize the most wealthy in their provinces. In other words, what we have is taxpayers of modest income here in Alberta, and let's keep in mind there are nearly 1 million tax filers who earn less than $50,000 per year, have to pay additional taxes so that recipients in have-not provinces, like Quebec, can benefit from $7 a day daycare, cut-rate universities tuition, in vitro fertilization, and cheap electricity. Is there anything more indicative of the fact that the original vision of equalization was lost? It's the way that when low-income earners in Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan are forced to subsidize high-income Quebecers for childcare and university. So, what are the possible solutions to the equalization problem? Let me suggest a few possible refinements, and then a couple of a little more radical alternatives. Refinements. How about we add in the full hydro rates based on the market price for electricity for equalization? Peter Hawley's here this evening, and I would say that he explained it quite well in the National Post at the end of May. And this is the fact that Manitoba and Quebec are handsomely rewarded for undercharging their residents on hydropower. And this isn't chump change either. The Frontier Centre estimates between 2005 and 2010, Quebec undercharged its residents $28.6 billion, and because of what is essentially underreporting of Quebec income, they received $14.3 billion more in equalization than they otherwise would have. Second, remove non-renewable resources completely from the formula. Royalty resources are not, properly speaking, income, but rather they are the selling of an asset, and they shouldn't factor into calculations of income capacity at all. It also serves as a form of double counting, because companies who make their profits from the resources here also, they and their workers generate corporate income, personal income, property taxes, and sales taxes that are already counted in the formula for fiscal capacity. Number three, factor expenditures or cost of living into the equalization formula. Because under the current equalization formula, only potential revenue is a determining factor in calculating the payment. $1, as we know, will buy more social services in Prince Edward Island than it will in Alberta. However, the current formula treats the cost of providing these services as constant throughout the entire country. And the consequence of this is that when provinces are made equal on fiscal capacity, they actually are much better off when it comes to the ability to buy social services. They can buy everything more cheaply. Fourth, and this is a little more radical, let's replace the $15 billion equalization program through one of two things. We can do a direct transfer to individuals. The ultimate goal of equalization is to ensure that individuals get roughly equivalent access to essential services. It's not to ensure that provincial governments have equal revenues. So replacing equalization with something like an enhanced GST rebate or something like the working income tax benefit would get dollars into the hands of those who need it in every single province. Fifth, replace, once again, the $15 billion equalization program by lumping it in to those other transfers that Mr. Ignatieff talked about. The health transfer, the social transfer, which are distributed more fairly on a per capita basis. As he mentioned, equalization is only one way in which the government transfers money. The Canada Health Transfer is worth $30 billion, the social transfer is worth $11 billion, and they're earmarked for different types of social services. The per capita grants still do have an equalizing effect, because as I mentioned, we pay more per capita in taxes, but we would get back the same per capita in services. And also, a dollar goes much further in PEI than it does in Alberta. So we could, over a period of time, we could roll these in so that we just have these two transfers. In practice, that would mean that provinces like Quebec would end up receiving less of an overpayment. They would go from getting currently 7.3 under equalization to an additional 3.6 under an enhanced transfer. Alberta would go from getting 0 under equalization to getting 1.6 billion under an enhanced transfer. Ontario, which is struggling, would go from receiving 3.2 billion under equalization to 5.9 billion under an enhanced social and health transfer. It would be getting more of those dollars back to the provinces and where they are generated. Now, we could talk about a couple of other options, like the one Mr. Ignatieff alluded to, transferring tax points, or having the federal government make matching debt payments for provincial governments. That's been suggested in the past. We can do that in the Q&A. But let me just finish by saying that my vision of Canada is one that would see 10 strong provinces all able to stand on the strength of their own economies to provide the services that their own taxpayers want the provincial government to provide. It would create a funding structure that encourages provinces to actually develop their resources and their economies to their full value, rather than worrying if they develop a new stream of income that they're going to see their equalization clawed back. Let's fulfill the constitutional mandate of ensuring that there are reasonably comparable core services in provinces, but without any of the perverse incentives or any of the inequities that the equalization formula generates. Let's restore each province to strength, rather than continue to support policies that merely band-aid over our weaknesses. Thank you.
Mr. Ignatieff, 5 minutes to rebut.
Compliment Danielle on a very vigorous and highly substantive contribution, and that's good. I mean, that's the way we ought to be having this argument. You were constructive, you had suggestions, and one of the things I noticed in passing is that you're not actually, unless I misheard you, questioning the constitutional obligation of equalization. You're not actually questioning the goal in the Constitution, which is to provide a fiscal regime across our country in which we can succeed in providing roughly comparable services, the constitutional mandate. I don't hear you, in fact, saying equalization as a constitutional objective is the wrong way to go. What I hear you saying is, I don't like the way we're doing it, and I don't like the way some things are counted and other things are not counted. Market rates for electricity and all that. So let's understand where we disagree. We seem to be in a situation where we accept a common principle of equalization and then are arguing about how best to deliver it. I think there are a few areas where you are engaging in a certain kind of myth-making, if I'll be blunt, about Quebec particularly. It's interesting that you didn't talk very much about Atlantic Canada, where the needs for equalization are very, demonstrable. You're focusing on Quebec because you don't like their social programs, and you think equalization sets up perverse incentives for Quebec. Okay, I hear that. But let me repeat the point, which is important, which is that Quebec's social programs are not free riding on equalization. The Quebec people have decided in recurrent elections, whether you like their judgments or not, to pay in taxes twice what Alberta pays to fund said social programs, right? So the argument that somehow Alberta taxpayers are paying for, daycare when you can't get it in Alberta seems to me to mistake the fact that this is a province that has chosen, by public choice, to pay twice the tax rate you do. So if Alberta feels that they're having trouble providing good social services for Albertans, pay more provincial tax, and that's up to you, right? I mean, that's the kind of choice, that's my vision of a good federation. Different strokes for different folks. Quebec has made social choices which many Albertans don't agree with. Fine, okay. But it's not the case that Alberta is out underwriting those social choices. What equalization is doing is trying to get us to a situation where provinces have roughly comparable capacity across the country to provide the services that all Canadians think we need. Do we need changes in an equalization formula? Absolutely. And should we rethink how we calculate resource revenue? Fine. Should we put market rates for electricity in? Fine. But the devil's in the detail. You've got to get a price. What's the market price going to be, and what will the number be? You ground out some numbers that will be the consequences of the calculations. But those are details. The issue, which I'm pressing you on, is whether, in fact, as I hear you saying, you actually think the constitutional obligation to equalize in Canada is an obligation that Albertans should actually ultimately be happy with. You're quarreling at the edges, you're quarreling with the detail, you're quarreling with some of the way it works out, but I'm hearing you saying your Canada includes a commitment to equalization. Well, if that's your Canada, that's my Canada too. And then we have to argue about, okay, how you rejig the formula to make it work, because self-evidently, no one wants to run an equalization formula where the have provinces, a province like Alberta with the highest per capita income in the country, is feeling permanently aggrieved. And I get that. But, let's get a grip here. You've got the highest per capita income in the country. Leadership implies responsibility. And the $2.4 billion that we're talking about, we're not talking $19 billion. This is a debate about equalization. If we're talking about $2.4 billion, that seems chump change, to be blunt, to keep a country meeting that common obligation for equality and fairness.
I see Mr. Ignatieff is trying to maintain the current myth as much as he accuses me of trying to create a new myth. I think there is a question about the extent to which the provisions of the Constitution are legally binding. There have been a couple of legal scholars who say that the language is pretty subjective, is pretty vague, and they don't believe that the current method of equalization is protected by the Constitution. I can quote University of Alberta Law Professor Dale Gibson, as well as Professor Peter Hogg, that really what this statement is a statement of economic and social goals that ought to guide government policy, but are not enforceable in court. Now I do recognize that we are in a position today where an automatic switch to tax points would be very difficult for provinces that have already made so many decisions to harm their growth, to harm their ability to improve their economy. And I guess I don't look at Quebec's tax policies as ones where they're levying taxes and being able to pay for their own services. I think we all know, I was in economics and we learned about the Laffer curve, that the higher your taxes are, you can actually choke off a lot of additional income. If you have zero tax rates, you're going to get zero revenue. If you try to take 100% of what people make, you're going to have zero tax revenue. Somewhere along that curve, there's an optimal amount. And part of what has happened in Alberta, many people like to look at our resources, and of course our resources give us an advantage. But all of the other things give us an advantage too. We're not just over-equalizing because of royalties, we're over-equalizing because We have more people working. They're earning higher incomes. They're paying more personal income tax. They're buying more stuff. They're paying more GST. They're topped out on their CPP. They're topped out on their EI. We've got corporations that are earning income and they're paying more in profit taxes. These are the kinds of things that you want to see happen in places like Quebec. But they're not going to happen as long as they have a tax structure that chokes it off. So you actually created a system where the higher their taxes, the more they get rewarded by equalization, and so you've created a vicious cycle. Why would they reduce their taxes if it would also reduce their amount of equalization? And it is true. We have seen Quebec receive equalization and be a net contributor since back in the 60s. The last time Alberta had received equalization, I believe, was 61 or 62. If you look at what has happened over the intervening 40 or 50 years, we have paid, I believe, close to $300 billion. I'm looking at a bill to see if I have these numbers right. Close to $300 billion more in federal taxes than we've gotten back in benefits. Meanwhile, it's been almost the reverse in Quebec. And I do not see, under the current system, that Quebec is charting a path to financial independence. It's very hard. We have seen very few provinces that have done this. Newfoundland finally did. Saskatchewan finally did, but only when I think the advantages of developing their resources became so overwhelming that they realized that it would be silly for them to hold their economies back just to be able to get more money from Ottawa. When I was in Quebec, I talked to a person who said one of the arguments for them not developing their shale gas resources is that it would create a new revenue stream that would reduce their equalization. That is a sign that the program is not working. When you actually have people making calculations about strangling their economy, choking off resource development because they want to be able to benefit from additional transfers coming from Ottawa, that is a program that doesn't make sense. So I would say we have a two-step process here. I think the first step is actually developing an equalization program that restores more of this per capita principle. I think that people believe in a per capita principle, that whether I'm living here in Alberta or somebody is living in Quebec, having an equal amount of dollars transferred for social programs or an equal amount of dollars transferred for healthcare dollars, I think a lot of people accept that principle. Once we've gotten to that point, then we must have a conversation about how we transfer tax points. We went from a point in 2002-2003 where we were transferring $20 billion through health and social transfers to the provinces. By 2013-14, it will be up to $40 billion. And then on top of that, we've got equalization, which is $15 billion. This is a sign of a federal government that is taking in more tax revenues than it actually needs. And when the federal government takes in more tax revenues than it actually needs, that has in the past prompted a national conversation. Back in the 1930s, there was a commission that talked about how to restore the balance. They proposed that Ottawa would take over the debt payments of all of the provinces and that would free up their income. It was rejected. But back in when the established program financing came in 1977, that's when they did one of these other fundamental shifts. They gave a portion of the taxes back to the provinces and then had a grant program that made up the difference. If at that point they had done 100% of a tax point transfer, our provinces would actually be better off than they were under this mixed hybrid system of having tax points as well as transfers. I think we are on the cusp of having that same debate. And the point is we can't get to that point, I don't believe, until we solve this problem of the fundamental problems with how equalization is structured. So I've proposed a two-step process. Let's get transfers working that most people can agree with, and then let's talk about how we can do a tax point transfer, which, by the way, Quebec is in favor of, how we can do a tax point transfer so that we have more own source revenue going to each province, so that in Alberta we don't have to talk about what kind of programs Quebec has, or whether we support the programs that Quebec has. Those are decisions that Quebec can make. But as long as I feel like I'm paying for it to Ottawa, absolutely it is going to be a question that every single Albertan have to ask. Is this what the intention of equalization is? And I don't think that this is the intention of equalization.
Really quickly, to Mr. Ignatieff, I am challenging the constitutional mandate, and I'm challenging you, sir. I come from Prince Edward Island, and I speak from personal experience that your mandate is punishing the entrepreneurial spirit and free enterprise spirit of Prince Edward Islanders and Maritimers alike. redistribution and socialism does not work. I guess my question to you is, under that frame of reference, how do you possibly speak to an ex-Prince Edward Islander who has found his place in Alberta because they run their province fiscally? Prince Edward Island does not. And we've been punished by your policies in Eastern Canada. That's why we've made our home in Alberta. And I highly challenge being punished as a maritimer because of your policies.
Gracious me. In a long and happy and productive life, I've never been accused of being a socialist. Wonders never cease. It happened in the Calgary Petroleum Club. Can you beat that? A liberal gets accused of being a socialist in the Calgary Petroleum Club. Boy, what a night, eh? Sir, I don't make you... I hope you take that in good spirit, because Prince Edward Islanders are making a contribution all across the country, and I'm sure you're making a great contribution to your new home here. I just don't see, I think there are two things going on here. There's resentment in a rich province that you're subsidizing other provinces that are not doing so well and adopting social models that you don't like. So there's resentment there. And I'm saying $2.4 billion, relax. That's what I'm saying, number one. Number two, I don't buy this argument, which I'm getting from my friend from Prince Edward Island and from Danielle Smith, about the perverse effects of equalization in these other provinces. Different provinces make different social choices. Atlantic Canada has made a set of social choices. Four different provinces make different social choices and then have to live with the fiscal consequences. And Alberta's made some fiscal choices, some of which have landed it in a deficit, right? Alberta is not a picture of fiscal perfection and rectitude. Every province has challenges in this regard. But I don't believe that the cost of paying into and supporting the Federation is the source of Alberta's problems. I don't think it's having perverse effects in Alberta. That's not the reason you don't have adequate child care. Ask yourself why you don't have adequate child care in Alberta. That's not a problem about equalization and federal transfers. That's not the problem. That's a set of social choices that you made in Alberta, and you can fix them. Ditto in Quebec. There's a lively and vigorous debate in Quebec precisely about Laffer curve issues. Have we got the taxation rates at such a level that it's choking off enterprise? Everybody understands that. Give the Quebecers some credit for intelligence, for God's sake. They face the same fiscal realities you do. Alberta hasn't been brilliant about handling its fiscal house of cards, either has Quebec. But equalization is a different proposition. It is, do we pay into a common fund to make sure that we get roughly comparable levels of service across the country as a baseline? I repeat, none of that pulls down the fiscal capacity of Alberta. It doesn't touch the fiscal capacity of Alberta. It doesn't prevent Alberta from doing the good things that it wants. That's the point. And beneath this argument is a seething set of resentments about socialism, about, you know, the Quebecers and all this stuff. I mean, let's get up over this. This is a fantastic country. I said over dinner, you know, if I thought, you know, if I was asked, what country in the world would you like to play their cards? And everybody in the world wants to play Canada's cards. And there's something depressing about a conversation in which the richest province in the country with the highest per capita income, a fabulous future on top of God's own resources that give you 100 years of growth and development, a social model that you're extremely proud of, sitting here worrying about spending $2.4 billion on other parts of Canada. Just, I'm being blunt with you because I'm not running for election, but I don't get it.
I think we have to kill that part of the system. We have to get rid of this kind of political game that gets played with Ottawa holding all of the cars, having all of the tax capacity and increasing tax capacity, it's time for a reset. The fact that we've gotten to the point where we have, where we're transferring $55 billion between the different jurisdictions is a demonstration that Ottawa is simply taking too much. I don't think that this is a conversation that is inappropriate to have. It's a conversation we've certainly had multiple times in the past. And I will say one thing about PEI. Going to the third point I made about the problem with the Equalization program. If you actually adjusted the Equalization program on the basis of what it costs to deliver these services in each province, British Columbia and Ontario, who are paying into the program, would be down near the bottom of the list. They would have the lowest ability to pay for services because they're so expensive in their provinces. PEI, right up near the top. Alberta does well under this measure, but PEI would have the second highest ability to pay for programs based on the lower cost that they're paying for it. So this is one other perverse factor is in the overall equalization. I focus mostly on Quebec, but there are other issues that we see in other provinces that I think are equally frustrating for Albertans.
Thank you.
My question is directed to Professor Ignatieff. As a former Quebecer and neo-Albertan, I think I resent a little bit the assumption, the presumption indeed, that we are resentful here. We are not. Rather, the question is about dependency. You're a scholar, you understand the whole business about dependency. I, as a former Quebecer, I look at my family back there and see the state of dependency in which they find themselves. It is perhaps out of charity, out of love, if you will, that we are concerned with the fact that they are deepening themselves into a hole, an economic hole, with Alberta's money.
Well, I want to invite you to tell me what you mean by dependency. Dependency conjures up welfare dependency, sitting on the couch doing nothing, cashing your check every week. It's full of moral opprobrium. I mean, I just don't see that much in Quebec. There's welfare dependency right across the country. That's always a problem. I don't like it any more than anybody else in this room because I pay taxes the same way you do, and I have all the same moral feelings you do about that. I want everybody to pay their own freight, and pay their own way, and stand on their own feet. And I like the idea of a Canada in which provinces have the fiscal capacity to stand on their own feet and take responsibility to balance their budgets and not. So at an abstract level, at a moral level, there isn't really a disagreement. And if I implied that you're all seething with resentment, I'm delighted to discover you're not seething with resentment. Withdraw the remark without any hesitation at all. Albertans don't seem to be, resentful. They seem to be fantastically proud of being Albertans. And the issue is how we deal with the fact that the cards have been dealt across this country in very unequal ways. Alberta has been dealt God's own hand. That's where we start. It's an uncertain hand. I understand you've lived boom and bust. You're riding commodity price cycles that are very uncertain. It's very difficult to manage that. I'm not saying you haven't got problems, but you've been dealt God's own hand compared to pretty well every other province. And so then the issue is how Alberta leads. How Alberta leads. You're not in a position to dictate the social programs and political philosophy of other provinces. Quebec is going to go its own way and has gone its own way for 142 years and is still with us, and I hope will be with us forever. Next door, other provinces will do things very differently. And that's the strength of the Federation. And you don't like some of the choices they make, fine. But what I would argue is simply two simple points. It's good for the country. It's good for our idea of citizenship to guarantee roughly comparable levels of fiscal capacity to every province as a baseline, so that from there, provinces then make the social and political choices they want to make. That seems to me a good idea of a country. If we don't do that, I don't predict that the country will blow apart. Equalization is too small a part of what holds us together to really, for its loss to be devastating. But I do say the values embedded in this, it seems to me, are the values of equality of opportunity and equality of starting conditions for all Canadians. And how we do that, you and I, if you ever have the honor of being in government, you will then sit down with your partners in the Federation and work out a deal that works for Alberta. But start from that premise. How do we create one country in which starting conditions for all our citizens are roughly equal and your fate is not determined by your darned postal code? That's what this is really about. And all the rest of it is small change.
Danielle, those are fairly similar questions. Do you mind if we go to
Sure, go ahead.
another one? Sir?
Okay, well, first of all, quick observation. You know, the fact is that around the world, there's a funny thing about human nature, and that is that those who get the most from people appreciate it the least from those they get it from. But I think we need to take this to a personal level, and that because this isn't about politicians, this isn't about Albertans worrying that we're going to pay the same amount no matter what, Michael, right? You said, but to build a better country, how do we build a better country? By facilitating dysfunctional government, high taxes, bad government activities. How do we facilitate the fact that through many of the years, we put that $9 billion a year into Quebec and helped the Parti Québécois try to take the country apart? How do we build a better country and avoid some of those things?
It's a great point, and that raises up to the issues that matter. How do we build a better country, and how do we do it together? How do we avoid perverse effects? Your position is that all of these transfers have nothing but perverse effects. I'm simply disagreeing. I think there are a lot of things about the Quebec economy and Quebec social performance that are just fine. This is not. The disagreement here is also a disagreement about political philosophy. You know, let's be honest here. You know, one of the reasons that the Federation has been so successful is we allow persistent social experimentation in each province. Different strokes for different folks. Alberta has a particular political philosophy that has had a lot of success. It's had a lot of help from nature and from God and all those things, but it's had a lot of success. Low tax regimes, encouraging entrepreneurship, fine. But other provinces and other parts of the country draw a different balance. And the point of Canada is what you think is the way to stimulate jobs and growth and an economic future for Canadians is not what other jurisdictions necessarily. So how do we create a country in which that social experimentation goes on a base of rough comparability, right? Nobody goes to the wall. There's a base, a floor beneath which you can't fall. Nobody's fiscal capacity is pulled down, but the base is solid for everybody. And then 10 provinces go out and experiment about how we get the good life for our citizens. That seems to me what Canada is. And that's the Canada that I think requires some form of equalization program to create the base, the floor beneath which no government can sink. And if you're saying that has perverse consequences, then we simply disagree about that.
I would say that every province has won the resource lottery, but not every province takes advantage of developing the resources to the maximum capacity. You just have to look at our great friends next door in Saskatchewan, now that they've got their groove back. I mean, they always had oil and gas and potash and uranium, but it took a leader who saw a different vision and different future for Saskatchewan, one where they could stand on their own 2 feet, where they could be a net contributor, and they got the residents excited about that vision. Quebec has immense resources, but because of these kinds of supports that they have historically enjoyed for 50 years or so, I think they have compromised their ability to be able to offer that same future for their residents. And the more we enable that, the more they are going put a moratorium on shale gas, or lecture us at international conferences about CO2 emissions. They want to have it both ways, in our opinion. I mean, it's very frustrating to see Quebec go to international conferences and blame Alberta for crimes against the planet. Meanwhile, we all know that it's the development of our resources here that has given so much resources to Ottawa to be able to distribute to have-not provinces, of which Quebec is the principal beneficiary. So we are actually enabling a province to continue to take potshots at the actions of our economy all the while they are benefiting from it. That's one point. The other I would say is that it's not that we covet the social programs that Quebec has. It's that we are suffering from not being able to pay for core infrastructure for ourselves. If you look at what when we were going through our biggest boom, trying to manage growth pressures, we had to go from spending $1.5 billion a year in infrastructure, $7 billion a year, and we're still not caught up. I travel around the province and talk to municipalities, and every one has a list the length of my arm of how long, or how the kinds of projects that they need, whether it's seniors facilities or schools or hospitals, whether it's road infrastructure or new bridges, overpasses. Every single community has these needs, and in addition to that, because we have such a booming economy, when a project gets started, it may get started at a $200 or $300 million price tag, but invariably it ends up escalating 3 or 4 times that amount. We've got a hospital in Calgary that started off as a $500 million hospital, is now a $1.5 billion hospital. Would $2.4 billion staying in this province or being transferred back through a different mechanism go a long way towards alleviating a lot of those infrastructure concerns at the local level? You absolutely bet they will. And so this is, I think, the concern that we have, is that Alberta is in a position where we have core critical infrastructure needs that are not being met, and we need to see more of the dollars that are generated here stay here, whether through a fairer system of transferring resources back to the recipient provinces, or whether it's through ultimately what I think is the solution, is a transfer tax point. So we actually have the means to be able to pay for our continued growth of our economy, and Quebec would then also have the advantage of being able to benefit from that as well, and also we would be eliminating the perverse incentives that have prevented them from doing that for so many decades.
My question refers to postal codes, human rights, and productivity. Almost everybody here, their family or they came from somewhere else. They moved to seek greater opportunity. They weren't tied to their postal code. They did not have an inalienable human right to live on that rock in that postal code and to be there. And productivity in Canada lacks compared to other jurisdictions around the world. And I would say that the greatest way to achieve that productivity would be to enable and encourage mobility throughout the country so that we can achieve that. And I would hope that you would address that.
Well, I teach human rights for a living, and I quite agree with you. I've never seen in the Human Rights Code any inalienable right to live on a rock. You definitely got that right. I'm not, my name's Ignatieff. My family came here as immigrants. They harvested in Alberta and Saskatchewan in the 20s and 30s. They came here. I get every point you're making about the importance of mobility, the importance of starting again and having a country in terms of Canada itself where people leave a place where they're stuck and come to a place like Saskatchewan and Alberta to make their future. But do we really want a country where hope has simply vanished from large parts of our country? One of the things that haunted me when I was in national politics was the highly unequal distribution of hope. The sense that hope had flown from remote, northern, small town, fishing village, Canada, and hope had flown to Calgary, hope had flown to Edmonton, hope had flown to Vancouver, hope had flown to Regina, hope had flown to Saskatoon. And this is a big issue for our country. Because on the one hand, you want the bright kids to get up and move, exactly as you say. And our productivity and our growth in Alberta has been built by that. People picking up stumps and moving. Great. But you don't want to have the rest of the country left behind in a place where only grandparents and great-grandparents remain. You don't want to have that kind of country. You don't want to have, we talk about a growing inequality between urban Canada, rural and remote Canada, and one of the functions of equalization is to make sure we keep that base, that granite under everybody's feet, so that life goes on in Sackville, Nova Scotia, goes on in Outport, Newfoundland, goes on in remote Labrador, goes on. Because the other thing about this is the cycles change. There are places where hope is fled, you kind of keep it going, and then hope returns. Alberta's road cycles and booms. And my vision of the country is that you, of course you want to encourage labor mobility. But I made 2 points. You don't want to encourage the whole darn country to come here, because you won't be able to handle it. Danielle's just been saying how much this mobility puts pressure on your resources. One of the functions of equalization is to keep some folks back on the farm, right? I mean, that's how it works. So we're trying to balance 2 principles. Let the bright kids leave, but keep some granite under people's feet in provinces that don't have the resource wealth, that don't have the economic development. And, you know, of course we want, you know, nobody wants a Canada where these places are simply on the drip feed of federal transfers. Of course we want economic activity there, but you're not going to get economic activity, for example, if you simply transfer the stuff to individuals. You've got to have infrastructure. There got to be roads. You can't create jobs in rural New Brunswick unless there's some roads, unless there's some schools, unless there's a hospital or 2. And that's what it means by equalization, is about equalizing hope. And that seems to me something that we want to try and do in this country. And nobody's going to do it perfectly. But that's what I think we're really talking about this debate.
When I was with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, we used to do a national survey of our members, or small business members, on the issue of what their top issue was as a small business employer. And in virtually every province, within the top 3, issues were taxes, no surprise, regulation, no surprise. But shortage of qualified labor was another one that was high up the list, and it didn't matter whether you were in a booming economy like Alberta or one with a high employment rate like one of our friends in Eastern Canada. What that says, and I think this goes back to the issue of the EI program, which is another one of these transfers, because we have, with our generosity, thought that we needed to take the approach Mr. Ignatieff said, we've got to keep people home. Well, what we've done is we've paid many people to stay home in seasonal jobs where they're not working year-round, and they've got accustomed to a lower productivity way of managing their own finances. We see this even here, when people come to our Fort McMurray oil sands from places in Eastern Canada and work just to get topped up enough so that they can go back home and collect employment insurance. It's another failed program. Yes, let's make sure that we have equalization of hope, equalization of opportunity, but I don't think it's hopeful when you have a system that encourages people to stay at home in their home province and we pay them not to work, which is what we've done with our employment insurance program. I would also argue that this issue of hope, this issue of inspiration, this issue of giving a populace its aspiration back, it doesn't come from the federal government. It doesn't come from a federal leader. If you look at what we have seen across this province, the provinces where we've seen a turnaround, Jean Charest saw a turnaround in the attitude in Quebec. Just look at the employment numbers there. Look at Newfoundland with Danny Williams. Look at Saskatchewan with Brad Wall, and I'm sure there are other historical examples. But this is, I guess, the difference that we have. Is does the motivation for a province to be able to take those steps ahead to improve their economy, does it come from federal programs and federal transfers and a federal idea? Or does it come from enabling those provincial leaders with the transference of tax points, with a structure that doesn't kill motivation of their workers, with something that allows them to be able to benefit from making those changes that improve their economy? Is that what is ultimately going to get these provinces back on the track? I think so. I think Mr. Ignatieff thinks the opposite. I think that he believes that we can use the federal spending power to spread hope around. I don't think that happens. I think you actually see the motivation occur when you empower provinces with their own ability to chart their own destiny, and we need to do more of that.
We have time for just 2 more questions, sir.
Thank you. I'm born and raised in Alberta, and Peter Lougheed had 5 principles for resource development, oil sands in particular. Behave like owners, get fair price, add value, go slow, and practice statecraft. If you talk about hydro, Manitoba Hydro and Quebec Hydro leaving money on the table through subsidized low electricity rates, I as an Albertan think we should have a provincial sales tax. I think our income tax rates are too low, that we're selling off an asset that's non-renewable. Norway has a sovereignty fund of 500 billion, ours is 15 billion. How are we punishing ourselves with a low tax mantra for fear of sharing money with the rest of Canada when corporations are walking away with huge profits because our royalties are too low as owners? How would you factor that into a new equalization scheme?
Well, let me say a word. I think that Mr. Ignatieff raised the spectrum of the National Energy Program, so I may as well. My parents lost a home during that whole period, so it was an issue that affected many of us who grew up and were born and raised in this province. And I think it has affected our national discourse, and it has affected how Albertans look at Ottawa, and it has affected how Albertans look at the Liberal Party federally. I have spoken with ministers who have argued to me that we can't possibly invest in our Heritage Savings Trust Fund and grow it to the level like we see in Alaska or Norway, because it would make us a target of the federal government. That there's no way the federal government would allow us to have a $100 billion or $200 billion surplus fund with the kind of dynamics that we have in this country. And I think when you look back through those bad years of the National Energy Program, it was essentially a straight transfer from Alberta to Quebec. It was as much as $30 billion transferring to Quebec in those years. So I think that part of what will give Alberta the confidence to steward its resources well, and I think we need to, is fixing this issue that we have, where we believe that every time we are too successful, that we're going to be beaten on by Eastern Canada. And I don't think it's an idle concern. When you have national parties in the last election that were arguing against having tanker traffic off the West Coast, even though we have tanker traffic off the East Coast, who are arguing for a cap and trade program, which we know from studies that have been done by TD Bank that is just another wealth transfer out of places like Alberta and Saskatchewan to Eastern Canada. These are the kinds of things, when you have those kinds of political policies being advanced by national parties, I think it's no wonder that Alberta has the reaction that it does. I don't see that in the US, because I just came back from there. When I traveled around, I didn't hear people saying, gee, we're really jealous of Alaska because they give a $10,000 annual dividend to their people. I don't know if in Europe people say, gee, we're really jealous of Norway because they've got this great fund, and yet for some reason in Canada, I think we have actually a stunted discourse where we don't want one province to do too much better than the other. It's actually the opposite of what Mr. Ignatieff is talking about. It's actually, rather than keeping a baseline for fiscal transfers, it's almost like we're putting a ceiling on how well we can do. And that, I think, is the fundamental problem of why we can't get past this discussion, is that Albertans have felt like they have been targeted by particular policies because of our wealth, because we do well. And I think it has created an environment where we end up having these kinds of debates that may not be all that productive, because we can't seem to be moving past the point to an area of agreement. But I think we have to acknowledge the history that we had. And I think we have to acknowledge that that kind of resentment or jealousy, it exists throughout the entire country. It's not just one level.
respect, Danielle, I think you're missing the force of the question. I think you're using, a whole set of evoking the national energy policy, evoking malign, federal conspiracies to stunt Alberta's growth. The federal government is run by people from Alberta, for heaven's sake. I mean, you're talking as if there was some malign bunch of liberal gremlins in Ottawa.
I was
trying to
talking about your
hold you down.
campaign
The
platform.
Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of Canada is a member of Parliament for Calgary, for God's sake. Go and talk to him, see whether he's holding you down. I don't think he is, That's number one. But number two, on things like Heritage Fund, I mean, I defy you to claim seriously that somehow the federal government or other Canadians are holding Alberta back from creating a heritage fund. One of the biggest disappointments I have as a patriotic Canadian is that we don't have a wealth fund equivalent to Norway. It's a massive missed opportunity. I would be so delighted as a proud Canadian if Alberta was in charge of a properly managed professional Norway-style fund that was investing all over the world and perhaps even a little in Canada. The idea that somehow you're being held back from these social choices by malign outside influence seems to me to be ridiculous, to be blunt. Ridiculous.
And I think this...
Come on, you're the leader. You're the leader of the Federation. That's what I'm saying. You're the leader of the Federation. Step up and stop complaining.
Well, I guess I would say I think that this is why that there is such a huge opportunity with Stephen Harper in Ottawa. I don't think we had an opportunity to be able to constructively discuss how the federal transfer program works when we had previous Liberal governments. I think that we do have a federal Prime Minister who understands focused federalism and the aspirations of the provinces and provincial jurisdiction, and I think that there is an opportunity. And I think it's an opportunity we have to take now, because we do see shifting tides when we look historically, and it may well be that the tide will shift again in 10 or 15 years. And I think that this is the opportunity for us to make the changes that will not only be good for Alberta, but will be good for the rest of Canada.
No?
You can't let me have
That's my shot.
Our last question. Sir.
Let's say, and heaven forbid, that Alberta and the other half provinces should overnight decide that they want everything that Quebec has. So they overnight become have-not provinces. Quebec and the have-not provinces become the have provinces. So what happens to the granite baseline? Does it keep falling as every province becomes less and less? Like, if every province becomes more, how shall I say it, have-not, our baseline keeps dropping and goes, it becomes a vicious cycle. Only because we want more. And that's the whole problem as I see it is, we want more.
I don't see that problem the same way, but I think one of the facts about equalization is that it ought to be responsive to changing realities and changing fiscal capacity. As Danielle said, Saskatchewan was a recipient of equalization for a long time. We forget, how devastating the Depression was in Prairie Canada, and these much despised federal programs kept a lot of people alive in tough times. So my sense is this changes. Now the prairie provinces are rich and dynamic and going forward, and let's hope that goes on, and I believe it will go on for a century. What is changing is the state of health of the Ontario economy, for example. It's now a net recipient of equalization for the first time. That's a challenge. It's no part of my brief to say this is a perfect program that can stay stuck in granite forever. It seems to me it's been capped because we have to maintain, let's remember it's capped, it's not growing. It's capped to make sure that it doesn't exceed the fiscal capacity of the federal government. I disagree with Mr. Harper about almost everything, but I strongly agree with him about the necessity for tough fiscal discipline. It's my money, it's your money. Okay, so that, but we can envisage situations in which provinces pass out of receiving equalization and become provinces that donate. That's how it's going to go, it seems to me. And a fluid and flexible program that is willing to listen carefully to Alberta and say, okay, I hear you about electricity rates. I hear you about whether you should count natural resource revenue or not, whether you count it 50% or 100%. I think any federation that's flexible, which we actually listen to each other, will have that kind of conversation. But, you know, I don't agree with Danielle that this is maybe a constitutional obligation, maybe not. I don't think it's complicated. I think those words are clear, and they will sustain any court challenge that you, as a possible Premier of Alberta, would bring to the program. I think it's a constitutional obligation that serves Canadians well, provides that granite floor, and then allows the social experimentation, the political experimentation that makes us a strong and successful federation.
Let's maybe finish on an area of agreement then. Ontario is in real trouble. I mean, in some way, I've argued this from an Alberta perspective because I'm an Albertan and I see some of the consequences of this, and I think it is a program that results in perverse incentives. But if Ontario's capacity gets beyond a few $100s per person and gets to a few $1,000s per person, we're going to end up with real hardship in Ontario. I think Dalton McGuinty began talking about this years ago, about how Ontario is now in a position, especially when you look at the higher cost of delivering services, where they simply cannot afford the amount of fiscal transfer that is leaving their province and not coming back. That says to me, with the cap that Mr. Ignatieff spoke of, that the only way to solve the problem in Ontario is to be able to give them more own source revenue so that they can start taking care not only of the social needs that they have, but also of the immense debt that they have. I think we've been lulled because of looking at the European crisis of debt, looking at the federal $5 trillion debt racked up in the last 4 years in the United States. I think we've been complacent because our federal government has done relatively well. Ontario and Quebec are in dire circumstances from a debt financing and servicing point of view. Just look at Quebec. Quebec, the amount that they get through equalization, $7.3 billion, is almost enough to pay the finance charges on their debt, which I think is $7.6 billion. And Ontario is in its equal, perhaps worse on per capita basis, a debt situation. So this is a conversation that we need to have, not only for the have-not provinces, not only for the have provinces, but for what should be and has historically been our economic engine. It's very disturbing that Ontario is in a position where they are net recipient of equalization. And I don't know that we've seen a corner turn there. So the question is, how do we actually restore their ability to have enough own source revenues to take care of this? We obviously can't transfer to them to the significant level that we've been able to for small provinces like PEI. I think the end result of that is the only direction that we can go, is have a fair system of transfers that returns more to Ontario, and ultimately have a discussion about how we resolve this problem of the federal government backing out of the tax and transfer programs that it has and transferring tax points so that every province has that ability to be able to take care of its own needs.